Welcome, weary soul, to a sanctuary of ancient wisdom where time moves like honey through moonbeams, and the weight of your day can finally dissolve into something softer, something deeper. Tonight, you've found your way to a collection of sacred stories that have been whispered across centuries, passed down through generations of seekers who understood that the most profound healing happens not when we fight against the darkness, but when we learn to rest within it. These are the Untold Buddhist Tales, stories that have never graced the pages of popular books or echoed through meditation halls. They are the forgotten whispers of enlightened beings, the gentle teachings that were shared only in the quietest moments between master and student, when the world had grown still and hearts had opened like night-blooming flowers. You may have come here carrying the accumulated stress of endless responsibilities, the persistent chatter of an anxious mind, or simply the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from trying too hard to hold everything together. Whatever burden brought you to this moment, know that it is welcome here. In the Buddhist tradition, suffering is not seen as a flaw to be fixed, but as a doorway to be walked through with compassion and understanding. Tonight, I will share with you 5 extraordinary tales that have been hidden in the depths of ancient monasteries, stories so profound that they were reserved only for those ready to receive their deepest teachings. Each tale carries within it a medicine for the modern soul, a balm for the wounds that daylight hours can inflict upon our tender hearts. But before we begin our journey together, let me offer you an invitation. This is not a race to reach some destination of enlightenment. There is no test at the end, no achievement to unlock. These stories are gifts meant to be received with the same gentle acceptance you would show to falling snow or the rhythm of your own heartbeat. If your mind wanders, let it wander. If sleep begins to claim you, surrender to its embrace. The wisdom contained within these tales will find its way into your consciousness, whether you're fully awake or drifting in that liminal space between awareness and dreams. The Buddha himself understood the power of stories to transform consciousness in ways that direct teaching could never achieve. He knew that when we hear a tale, we don't just listen with our minds, we listen with our entire being. Our hearts recognize truth even when our thoughts are quiet, and our souls absorb healing even when we believe we're simply being entertained. So settle now into whatever position brings you comfort. Feel the weight of your body being fully supported. Notice how your breath naturally slows as you give yourself permission to simply be here in this moment without needing to accomplish anything at all. The world will continue turning without your vigilant attention. Your responsibilities will wait patiently for tomorrow's light. Right now, the only task before you is to receive these ancient gifts with an open heart. Our first tale comes from a mountain monastery hidden so deep in the Himalayas that it appears on no maps and is known only to the snow leopards and the wind. It is the story of a young monk named Tenzin, whose struggle with finding peace will sound remarkably familiar to anyone who has ever lain awake at night, mind spinning with worries and what-ifs. Tenzin had joined the monastery with the purest of intentions. He had read every sacred text, memorized countless sutras, and could recite the Noble Eightfold Path with scholarly precision. Yet despite his dedication, despite his sincere efforts to follow every teaching, inner peace seemed to slip through his fingers like water through cupped hands. The harder he grasped for enlightenment, the more elusive it became. Each night, as his fellow monks settled into serene meditation and eventually peaceful sleep, Tenzin would lie on his simple mat, his mind churning with self-doubt and frustration. Why can't I find the peace that seems so effortless for others? He would wonder, what am I doing wrong? Am I not worthy of the Buddha's teachings? The abbot of the monastery, a wizened man whose eyes held the depth of still mountain lakes, had been watching young Tenzin struggle with compassionate concern. He had seen this pattern many times before. Earnest seekers who approached enlightenment like a fortress to be conquered, rather than a flower to be allowed to bloom. One evening, as the last light faded from the mountain peaks and the monastery settled into its nightly rhythm, the abbot approached Tenzin's quarters. He found the young monk sitting rigidly in meditation posture, his jaw clenched with effort, his breathing forced and unnatural. "Walk with me," the abbot said softly, his voice carrying the gentle authority that comes from decades of understanding. Without waiting for a response, he turned and began walking toward the monastery garden. The garden was a small miracle of cultivation, somehow thriving despite the harsh mountain climate. Prayer flags fluttered overhead, and the sound of a small stream provided a constant, soothing backdrop. The abbot led Tenzin to a bench beside a particularly ancient pine tree, its trunk gnarled and weathered by countless seasons. "Tell me, young monk," the abbot began, his voice barely above a whisper, "when you try to fall asleep at night, what do you do?" Tenzin looked puzzled. "I lie down, close my eyes, and try to empty my mind of all thoughts, just as the teachings instruct." The abbot nodded slowly. "And how well does this approach serve you?" "Not well at all," Tenzin admitted, his voice heavy with frustration. "The more I try to stop thinking, the more thoughts seem to arise. It's as if my mind becomes more active the moment I attempt to quiet it." "Ah," said the abbot, his eyes twinkling with gentle understanding. "And tell me, what happens to this pine tree when winter comes?" Tenzin glanced at the ancient tree, confused by the seemingly unrelated question. It doesn't fight the snow. It simply allows the weight to rest upon its branches until the snow naturally falls away or melts." "Indeed. And what would happen if this tree tried to shake off every snowflake the moment it landed?" Understanding began to dawn in Tenzin's eyes. It would exhaust itself. It would waste all its energy fighting against the natural flow of the seasons. The abbot smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features into something radiant. "Your thoughts, dear Tenzin, are like snowflakes. They will fall upon the branches of your mind whether you welcome them or not. The question is not how to prevent them from landing, but how to allow them to rest there lightly until they naturally dissolve." As if summoned by their conversation, actual snowflakes began to drift down from the darkening sky, each one unique and perfect in its brief journey from cloud to earth. The two monks sat in comfortable silence, watching this ancient dance of descent and dissolution. "But Master," Tenzin finally whispered, "how do I learn to be like the tree? How do I stop fighting with my own mind?" The abbot reached into his robes and withdrew something that made Tenzin gasp in wonder. It was a small, perfectly spherical stone that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The surface was so smooth, it appeared to have been polished by ocean waves for centuries, yet they were high in the mountains, far from any sea. "This stone," the abbot said, placing it gently in Tenzin's palm, "was given to me by my teacher, who received it from his teacher before him. It has been passed down through our lineage for over 300 years. Do you know what makes it so special?" Tenzin examined the stone carefully, feeling its surprising warmth against his skin. "It's beautiful, Master, but I don't understand what makes it unique." "This stone," the abbot continued, spent 100 years in a mountain stream. Every day, every night, water flowed over it, around it, through the space where it rested. The water never fought with the stone, never tried to change it or move it from its place. And the stone never resisted the water's constant caress. For 100 years, they simply coexisted in perfect harmony. The abbot paused, allowing his words to settle like the snow around them. The water wore away every rough edge, every sharp corner, every imperfection, not through force or effort, but through gentle, constant presence. The stone became perfect, not by fighting against the water, but by surrendering to its flow. Tenzin felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as the teaching penetrated his understanding. You're saying that my thoughts are like the water, and my awareness is like the stone? Precisely. Your thoughts will flow through your consciousness, whether you invite them or not. But if you can learn to rest in awareness the way this stone rested in the stream, neither pushing thoughts away nor clinging to them, they will gradually polish away all the rough edges of your suffering. The young monk sat in wonder, feeling the smooth stone in his palm and watching the snowflakes continue their graceful descent. For the first time in months, his mind felt spacious rather than cramped, open rather than clenched. Tonight, the abbot said, rising from the bench, when you lie down to rest, hold this stone in your hand. Feel its smoothness, its warmth. Remember that it achieved this perfection not through struggle, but through patient acceptance of what flowed around it. Let your thoughts be like water over stone, and let your awareness be like the stone itself, unmoved yet not unmovable, present yet not possessive. As they walked back toward the monastery buildings, Tenzin felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of a knot he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. The teaching wasn't asking him to become something different. It was inviting him to remember what he already was beneath all his efforts and strivings. That night, for the first time since arriving at the monastery, Tenzin fell asleep easily. He held the ancient stone in his palm and allowed his thoughts to flow like water, neither fighting them nor feeding them. And in that space of gentle allowing, peace found him as naturally as snowflakes find the earth. But Tenzin's story was only beginning. The lessons he would learn from that smooth stone would transform not only his own understanding, but would eventually touch the lives of countless others who would hear his tale. The abbot had given him more than just a teaching. He had offered him a key to unlock the prison of his own making. The days that followed brought a transformation so subtle that Tenzin almost didn't notice it at first. Like dawn creeping across mountain peaks, the change came not as a dramatic revelation, but as a gradual softening of the edges that had once felt so sharp and unforgiving. Each morning when he woke, he would find the stone still warm in his palm, as if it had been absorbing not just the heat of his body, but some deeper essence of tranquility throughout the night. But the real test of his newfound understanding came 3 weeks later, when the monastery received an unexpected visitor. A wealthy merchant from the valley below had climbed the treacherous mountain path, driven by desperation and a burden of grief so heavy it seemed to bow his shoulders toward the earth. The merchant's name was Lobsang, and his story unfolded like a scroll of sorrow as he sat in the monastery's receiving hall. His only daughter, barely 16 years old, had fallen gravely ill with a mysterious ailment that left her hovering between waking and sleeping, neither fully present nor completely absent. The finest physicians in all the land had examined her, offering expensive remedies and elaborate treatments, yet nothing had helped. She grew thinner each day, as if some essential part of her was slowly slipping away like sand through an hourglass. "I have heard," Lobsang said, his voice breaking with emotion, "that the monks of this monastery possess wisdom beyond the reach of ordinary medicine. I have brought gold, precious stones, rare silks from distant lands. I will give everything I own if you can help my daughter return to us." The abbot listened with the same profound attention he brought to all suffering beings, his weathered hands folded gently in his lap. When the merchant finished speaking, silence filled the hall, like incense smoke, thick with unspoken prayers and desperate hope. "Your love for your daughter honors you," the abbot finally said, his voice carrying the warmth of a hearth fire on a winter night. "But tell me, friend, in all your searching for a cure, have you considered that perhaps your daughter is not lost, but simply resting in a place that exists between the shores of sleeping and waking?" Lobsang looked confused, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights spent watching over his child. "I don't understand, Venerable One. She barely responds to our voices. She takes no food, drinks only a few sips of water. How can this be considered rest?" The abbot smiled with infinite compassion. "There are many kinds of rest, dear father. Sometimes the soul grows weary not from too much activity, but from too much resistance to the natural rhythms of existence. Perhaps your daughter has not fallen ill, but has instead discovered a doorway that most of us spend our entire lives seeking." He paused, allowing his words to settle like seeds in fertile ground. "I will not promise you a miracle cure, for that would be both dishonest and unkind. But I can offer you something that might be even more valuable. The story of another young person who learned to navigate the mysterious waters between consciousness and dreams." Tenzin, who had been listening from the back of the hall, felt his heart skip like a stone across still water. He realized that the abbot was about to share a teaching that would transform not only this grieving father's understanding, but would weave together threads of wisdom that had been gathering in the monastery's collective consciousness for generations. "Many years ago," the abbot began, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence that marked the beginning of a sacred tale, "there lived in a distant kingdom a young princess named Dolma, whose beauty was matched only by her kindness. She had hair like spun moonbeams and eyes that reflected the depth of mountain lakes. But more than her physical beauty, it was her ability to see into the hearts of others that made her beloved throughout the realm." The merchant leaned forward, hungry for any story that might offer hope or understanding. Even the younger monks gathered closer, sensing that they were about to receive a teaching that would illuminate corners of wisdom they had never before explored. Princess Dolma possessed a gift that was both blessing and burden, the abbot continued. She could sense the suffering of every living being within many miles of the palace. When a farmer's crop failed, she felt his despair as if it were her own. When a mother grieved for a lost child, Dolma's heart would break with identical pain. When elderly people lay dying in distant villages, she would experience their fear and confusion as intimately as if she were lying in their beds beside them. Tenzin found himself unconsciously fingering the smooth stone in his pocket, remembering his own struggles with the overwhelming nature of consciousness itself. The princess's gift sounded remarkably similar to his own sensitivity to the endless flow of thoughts and emotions that had once threatened to drown him. Had to help everyone first, Dolma try whose suffering she could feel. She would send food to hungry families, medicine to the sick, comfort to the grieving. But the kingdom was vast, and suffering seemed endless. For every person she helped, 10 more would appear in her awareness, their pain calling out to her like voices in the night. The abbot's voice grew softer, drawing his listeners deeper into the tale. Gradually, the constant flow of others' suffering began to overwhelm the young princess. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped engaging with the world around her. Her parents watched in horror as their vibrant daughter seemed to fade before their eyes, becoming translucent as morning mist, as if she were slowly dissolving into the very compassion that defined her. Lobsang gasped, his hand flying to his chest. "This sounds exactly like what is happening to my daughter. She lies so still, so pale, as if she's being pulled towards some other realm." "Yes," the abbot nodded gently. "The royal physicians were as baffled as your doctors have been. They tried every remedy known to their art, but Princess Dolma continued to drift further from the waking world. It was as if she had become a bridge between the realm of the living and some other dimension of existence, and the strain of maintaining that bridge was consuming her life force." The hall fell silent, except for the soft whisper of prayer flags moving in the evening breeze. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, their light as ancient and patient as the wisdom being shared within the monastery walls. The king and queen were beside themselves with grief and desperation. They sent messengers to every corner of the known world, seeking anyone who might understand their daughter's mysterious condition. Finally, after months of fruitless searching, an old wandering monk arrived at the palace gates. Tenzin smiled slightly, recognizing the archetypal pattern of the wise teacher appearing at the moment of greatest need. It was a theme that appeared in countless Buddhist tales, yet each iteration carried its own unique medicine for the souls ready to receive it. "This monk was unremarkable in appearance," the abbot continued. "His robes were patched and faded, his possessions few. The palace guards almost turned him away, assuming he was just another beggar seeking charity. But something in his eyes, a depth that seemed to reflect infinity itself, convinced them to allow him an audience with the desperate royal family." The merchant hung on every word, his entire being focused on this tale that seemed to mirror his own situation so precisely. Hope and fear warred in his expression as he waited to learn what wisdom the mysterious monk might offer. When the wandering monk was brought to Princess Dolma's bedside, he did something that surprised everyone present. Instead of examining her condition or asking questions about her symptoms, he simply sat beside her in complete silence for 3 full hours. He breathed with the same rhythm as her shallow breathing. He remained as still as her motionless form. He entered so completely into her state of being that observers began to wonder if he too was falling under the spell of whatever mysterious force held the princess captive. The abbot paused in his telling, his eyes meeting each listener's gaze in turn. But then, as the sun began to set and golden light streamed through the palace windows, the monk opened his eyes and smiled with such radiant joy that everyone in the room felt their hearts lift despite their sorrow. "Your daughter," he told the king and queen, "is not dying. She is learning to live in a way that most beings never discover. She has found the secret doorway between compassion and consciousness, but she has become lost in the passage between them. She needs someone to show her how to walk that path without being consumed by it." Lobsang's eyes filled with tears of recognition and desperate hope. But how? How can such a thing be taught? How can someone learn to carry such sensitivity without being destroyed by it? The abbot's smile deepened, and Tenzin realized that they had arrived at the heart of the teaching, the moment when ancient wisdom would reveal its most precious secret. Ah, dear friend, that is where our story becomes truly extraordinary. The monk asked to be left alone with the princess for one entire night, from sunset to sunrise. The king and queen were reluctant, but their desperation overcame their caution. The evening air seemed to hold its breath as the abbot prepared to reveal the monk's mysterious method. That night, the wandering teacher did not try to wake Princess Dolma or pull her back into ordinary consciousness. Instead, he joined her in the liminal space where she had become trapped. He taught her, while she slept, the most profound secret of compassionate existence. The monastery bells began their evening call, their bronze voices carrying across the mountain valley like prayers made audible. The sound seemed to weave itself into the fabric of the story, adding another layer of resonance to the ancient wisdom being shared. He whispered to her sleeping spirit the same teaching that had been passed down through his lineage for countless generations, that true compassion is not about taking on the suffering of others, but about becoming a clear mirror that reflects their pain back to them, transformed into understanding. Like a mountain lake that shows the sky its own face while remaining perfectly still and undisturbed by the clouds that pass overhead. Tenzin felt the stone in his pocket grow warm, as if responding to this deeper layer of the teaching he had begun to understand. The connection between his own struggle with overwhelming thoughts and the princess's overwhelming compassion suddenly became crystal clear. The monk taught her, in the language of dreams and symbols, that the sleeping mind understands perfectly how to be present with suffering without becoming identical to it, how to offer the gift of witnessing without losing herself in the experience of others, how to love so completely that her love became a healing presence rather than a drowning pool. The merchant was weeping openly now, not from despair, but from recognition. And did she wake? Did the princess return to her family? She did indeed, the abbot confirmed, his voice warm with the satisfaction of a story finding its perfect resolution. But when Princess Dolma opened her eyes at sunrise, she was transformed. The overwhelming sensitivity that had once threatened to destroy her had become her greatest gift. She could still feel the suffering of others, but now she experienced it as a sacred trust rather than a crushing burden. The teaching continued to unfold like a flower blooming in the darkness, each petal revealing new depths of understanding. She discovered that her role was not to fix everyone's pain, but to hold space for it with such complete acceptance and love that the pain itself began to transform. People would come from great distances just to sit in her presence, and somehow their suffering would begin to shift and soften, not because she took it away, but because she showed them how to hold it with compassion. As the abbot's tale drew toward its conclusion, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky outside the monastery windows. The evening had deepened around them like a gentle embrace, and the listeners found themselves held in the same liminal space that the story described, suspended between waking wisdom and dreamlike understanding. Princess Dolma lived a long and blessed life, the abbot concluded, serving as a bridge between the world of ordinary consciousness and the realm of infinite compassion. She never married, for her love had grown too vast to be contained within conventional boundaries. Instead, she became a mother to all suffering beings, showing them through her own example how to transform pain into wisdom, isolation into connection, and despair into the deepest possible peace. The silence that followed felt sacred, pregnant with possibilities and understanding. Lobsang sat with tears streaming down his face, but his expression had transformed from desperate grief to something approaching wonder. "Venerable one," he whispered, "do you believe my daughter might be experiencing something similar? Could her illness be a kind of spiritual awakening rather than a medical condition?" The abbot nodded slowly, his weathered face illuminated by the soft glow of butter lamps that had been lit during the telling of the tale. "I believe your daughter's soul has found the same doorway that Princess Dolma discovered. She is learning to navigate the space between individual consciousness and universal compassion. But like the princess, she needs guidance to avoid becoming lost in that vast territory." He rose from his cushion with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades in mindful movement and gestured for Tenzin to approach. "Young monk," he said, "you have been learning the teaching of the stone and the stream. Now you will help me share an even deeper wisdom with our friend who has traveled so far seeking healing for his beloved daughter." Tenzin felt a flutter of uncertainty in his chest. "Master, I am still learning. How can I possibly help with something so important?" The abbot's eyes twinkled with gentle mischief. "Precisely because you are still learning, dear one. Your beginner's mind carries a freshness that my old understanding sometimes lacks. Bring the stone." With trembling fingers, Tenzin retrieved the smooth, warm stone from his pocket. Even in the lamplight, it seemed to glow with its own inner radiance, as if it had absorbed not just the heat of his body, but centuries of accumulated wisdom from all the hands that had held it before his. "Tell me, Lobsang," the abbot said, settling back onto his cushion. "When you sit beside your daughter's bed and watch her shallow breathing, what do you feel in your own body?" The merchant's face contorted with pain. "My chest grows tight, as if someone is squeezing my heart with iron hands. My breathing becomes shallow and rapid. Sometimes I feel as if I'm drowning in my own helplessness. I find myself holding my breath, as if I could somehow breathe for her, take her struggle into my own lungs." "Ah," the abbot nodded knowingly. "You love her so deeply that you are trying to carry her burden. But what if I told you that this very impulse, born from the purest love, might be creating a kind of spiritual interference that prevents her from finding her way back to ordinary consciousness?" Lobsang looked stricken. "Are you saying that my love is hurting her? That I should care less, feel less?" "Not at all," the abbot replied, his voice infinitely gentle. "I am suggesting that there is a way to love so completely, so perfectly, that your love becomes a healing force, rather than an additional weight for her to carry." He turned to Tenzin. "Show our friend the stone, young monk. Tell him what you learned from its teaching." Tenzin placed the ancient stone in Lobsang's weathered palm, watching as the merchant's eyes widened with surprise at its unexpected warmth. "This stone spent 100 years in a mountain stream," Tenzin began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "The water never tried to change the stone, and the stone never resisted the water's flow. Through perfect acceptance of what was, both the stone and the stream were transformed." Lobsang stared at the stone, feeling its smoothness against his skin. "But how does this relate to my daughter? How can acceptance help when she's slipping away from us?" "Your daughter is like the stream," the abbot explained, "flowing between different states of consciousness. And you, dear father, have been trying to be like a dam, using your will and your worry to redirect her flow back toward the shores of ordinary awareness. But what if, instead, you learn to be like the stone? The teaching hung in the air like incense smoke, visible yet intangible, profound yet simple." Tenzin felt his own understanding deepening as he watched the wisdom work its way into the merchant's consciousness. "I will travel back to the valley with you," the abbot announced suddenly. "And I will bring young Tenzin, for he carries something your daughter needs. The fresh understanding of someone who has recently learned to stop fighting with the flow of consciousness." The journey down the mountain took 2 full days, and during that time, the abbot shared story after story that seemed to layer meaning upon meaning like sediment, creating new geological formations in the merchant's understanding. Each tale carried medicine for different aspects of the healing that would be required. He told them about the Weeping Buddha, a statue that had appeared in a remote temple and began shedding tears that never ceased. Pilgrims came from across the continent, believing the tears to be miraculous, fighting to collect them in precious vessels. But the wisest among them simply sat in the Buddha's presence and allowed their own tears to flow freely, discovering that sorrow shared becomes compassion, and compassion shared becomes boundless love. He spoke of the invisible monastery, a sacred place that existed only for those who had learned to see with their hearts rather than their eyes. Travelers would search for it their entire lives, following maps and following guides, only to discover that it had been surrounding them all along, as present as the air they breathed, and as invisible as their own awareness. And he shared the tale of the sleeping master, an enlightened teacher who spent 40 years in a state that appeared to be deep slumber, but was actually the most profound form of meditation possible. Students would travel vast distances to receive his teachings, only to find him apparently unconscious. But those who had the patience to sit beside him in silence would find that wisdom flowed into their minds like water into empty vessels, teaching them truths that no words could ever convey. By the time they reached Lobsang's home, Tenzin understood that each story had been preparation for what they would encounter. The merchant's house was grand, but felt hollow, filled with the echoes of worry and the weight of accumulated grief. Servants moved through the halls with the careful silence of those who live in the presence of impending loss. Lobsang's wife, Pima, met them at the door. Her face was gaunt from sleepless nights, her eyes red-rimmed but still fierce with protective love. "You're the monks my husband spoke of," she said, her voice carrying both hope and skepticism. "Can you truly help our young Chen?" The abbot bowed deeply to her. "We cannot make promises about outcomes, dear mother, but we can offer presence, and sometimes presence is the most powerful medicine of all." They were led to Yang Chen's room, a chamber that had been transformed into something between a shrine and a sick room. Butter lamps flickered on every surface, casting dancing shadows on walls, hung with thankas depicting various healing Buddhas. The air was thick with the scent of medicinal herbs and the subtle fragrance of jasmine incense. And there, in the center of it all, lay the girl who had become the focus of so much desperate love and attention. Yang Chen was perhaps 16, with features that carried an otherworldly beauty even in her current state. Her breathing was so shallow it barely moved the silk coverlet that had been drawn up to her chin. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, as if she were slowly becoming transparent, gradually dissolving into some other dimension of existence. But what struck Tenzin most powerfully was the quality of peace that emanated from her still form. Unlike the tense atmosphere of worry that filled the rest of the house, the space immediately around Yang Chen felt profoundly calm. It reminded him of the deep silence that sometimes descended during the most profound meditations, when all struggle ceased and consciousness simply rested in its own nature. The abbot approached the bed with the same reverence he would show when entering the most sacred shrine. He knelt beside Yang Chen and placed his hand gently over her heart, not quite touching, but close enough to sense the subtle rhythms of her being. He remained in this position for so long that Tenzin began to wonder if the old teacher had entered some kind of trance himself. Finally, the abbot opened his eyes and smiled with an expression of such deep joy that the entire room seemed to brighten. "She is not lost," he announced softly. "She is exploring. She has discovered the secret passages that exist between different levels of consciousness, and she has been mapping this territory like a spiritual cartographer. But she has become so fascinated by what she's found that she has forgotten the way back to ordinary awareness." Pima clutched her husband's arm. "Can you bring her back? Can you guide her home?" "Home," the abbot repeated thoughtfully. "But where is home for a consciousness that has learned to travel freely between dimensions of awareness? Perhaps the question is not how to bring her back, but how to expand our understanding of what it means to be present." He gestured forward. "Place Tenzin to approach the stone in her palm," he instructed. "Let her sleeping spirit feel what you have learned about flowing and stillness." With hands that trembled slightly, Tenzin carefully lifted Yang Chen's limp hand and placed the ancient stone in her palm. The moment her fingers closed around it, something remarkable happened. The quality of her breathing shifted, becoming deeper and more rhythmic. A faint flush of color appeared in her pale cheeks, and her eyelids began to flutter as if she were experiencing vivid dreams. "Now," the abbot said, settling into a meditation posture beside the bed, "we begin the real work. We will not try to pull her back into our dimension of consciousness. Instead, we will learn to meet her where she is, to join her in that liminal space between sleeping and waking, and to show her that she can carry the gifts she has discovered there back into ordinary life." What followed was unlike any healing practice Tenzin had ever witnessed or even imagined. The abbot began to breathe in perfect synchronization with Yang Chen, matching not only the rhythm, but the depth and quality of each inhalation and exhalation. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to slow his breathing, and hers followed suit like a mirror reflecting his own life force. "This is the practice of conscious dreaming," he whispered to the assembled family. "We enter the realm where she has been dwelling, not as intruders trying to capture her and drag her back, but as fellow travelers offering to share the journey." Hours passed in this delicate dance of synchronized breathing and shared presence. The abbot would occasionally murmur what sounded like mantras or prayers, but they were in a language none of them recognized, syllables that seemed to carry meaning beyond words, vibrations that resonated in the bones rather than the ears. Tenzin found himself naturally falling into the rhythm, his own consciousness beginning to shift and expand in ways he had never experienced. It was as if the boundaries between his awareness and the sleeping girls had become permeable, allowing him to sense the vast territories she had been exploring in her prolonged journey between waking and sleeping. He began to perceive what the abbot had described, not illness or absence, but an extraordinary expansion of consciousness that had simply grown too vast to be contained within ordinary awareness. Yang Chen had discovered realms of compassion so profound that returning to normal human concerns felt impossibly small and limiting. She had touched the source of universal love and found herself unable to compress that infinite experience back into the confines of individual identity. As the night deepened and the butter lamps burned lower, something began to shift in the quality of presence that filled the room. It was as if invisible doors were opening, allowing communication between dimensions of consciousness that were usually separated by the veil of ordinary perception. The abbot's whispered words grew more distinct, and Tenzin realized he was speaking directly to Yangchen's sleeping spirit, offering guidance and reassurance in the same way a mountain guide might help a lost traveler find their way back to familiar paths. "You have seen the source," the abbot murmured, his voice carrying the authority of one who had walked these same mysterious territories. "You have tasted the nectar of universal compassion, and now you know the secret that most beings spend lifetimes seeking. But remember, dear child, that the greatest gift of this knowledge is not to remain dissolved in its vastness, but to bring its essence back into the world of form, where it can serve all beings who are still searching." Yangchen's breathing deepened further, and for the first time in months, she moved slightly in her sleep, turning her head toward the sound of the abbot's voice, as if recognizing a familiar guide in an unknown landscape. "The bridge between worlds is not meant to be a permanent dwelling place," the abbot continued, his words weaving themselves into what felt like a shared dream. "It is a passage to be crossed in both directions, allowing us to visit the source of all compassion and then return with its gifts to offer healing to a world that desperately needs what we have discovered." The stone in Yangchen's palm began to glow more brightly, as if responding to the deep teaching being offered. Tenzin could feel something shifting in the very fabric of the room's atmosphere, a loosening of the threads that had held the girl suspended between dimensions of consciousness. And then, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the room's windows, Yangchen's eyes slowly opened. But these were not the eyes of someone waking from ordinary sleep. They held depths that reflected infinite compassion, wisdom that seemed ancient beyond her 16 years, and a radiant peace that immediately filled the entire room with its healing presence. "Mother," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from some vast choir of awakened beings. "Father, I have been learning to love the way the mountains love, so vast and steady that nothing can disturb it, so present and accepting that everything finds rest in its embrace." Pema collapsed beside the bed, tears of relief and wonder streaming down her face. Lobsang knelt on the other side, his merchant's practical mind struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing, but their daughter's presence was so profoundly peaceful that questions seemed unnecessary. Understanding flowed between them without need for words. "The monk showed me," Yangchen continued, sitting up slowly and looking at the abbot with eyes that recognized him as an old friend rather than a stranger. "He taught me that consciousness is like water. It can take any shape, flow into any space, but it never loses its essential nature. I learned to be the water and the container, the dreamer and the dream." She turned to Tenzin, still holding the ancient stone, and smiled with recognition that made his heart skip. "And you, brother monk, you showed me how to be still like stone while letting the waters of compassion flow around and through me without being swept away by their current." In the days that followed, word of Yangchen's awakening spread throughout the valley like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. But those who came expecting to witness miraculous healing found something even more extraordinary. A young woman who had learned to embody the very teachings that the greatest masters spent lifetimes trying to understand. She did not return to the life of an ordinary merchant's daughter. Instead, she became a bridge between worlds, helping others who had become lost in the vast territories of expanded consciousness. Her parents' house transformed into an informal sanctuary where people came seeking guidance for spiritual experiences that transcended ordinary understanding. The abbot and Tenzin remained for several weeks, observing and learning as much as teaching. They watched as young Chen worked with individuals who had touched profound states of awareness but couldn't integrate them into daily life. People who had glimpsed enlightenment but found themselves unable to function in ordinary consciousness. Seekers who had expanded beyond individual identity but needed to learn how to bring that expansion back into service to others. Her method was always the same: deep listening, synchronized breathing, and the patient guidance of someone who had successfully navigated the passage between dimensions of consciousness. She would hold the ancient stone while working with others, allowing its accumulated wisdom to flow through her into whoever needed its medicine. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Yang Chen's teaching was its ordinariness. She did not claim special powers or demand recognition as an enlightened being. She simply lived each day with such complete presence and acceptance that her very existence became a teaching about the possibility of integrating profound spiritual realization with the simple activities of human life. She would tend her mother's garden with the same reverence she brought to deep meditation. She would help her father with his business correspondence while maintaining the vast awareness she had discovered in her journey between worlds. She prepared meals, swept floors, and engaged in ordinary conversation while never losing touch with the infinite compassion that had become her natural state. This integration of transcendent awareness with mundane activity became the foundation for what would later be known as the path of ordinary enlightenment, a way of spiritual development that honored both the heights of mystical experience and the practical requirements of life in physical form. As their time in the valley drew to a close, Tenzin realized that he had received the most profound teaching of his young monastic life. He had learned that enlightenment was not an escape from the human condition, but its most complete fulfillment. He had seen that the greatest spiritual gifts were meant to be shared rather than hoarded, integrated rather than transcended. The night before their departure, Yang Chen asked to speak privately with Tenzin. They walked together in her family's garden, where night-blooming jasmine filled the air with its intoxicating fragrance, and stars reflected in the small pond like scattered diamonds. "The stone will stay with me for now," she said, placing her hand over the place where it rested in his robes. "But its teaching lives in you now. You carry the wisdom of flowing and stillness, of acceptance and transformation. When you return to the monastery, you will find that everything has changed because you have learned to see with new eyes." She paused beside the pond, her reflection merging with the starlight on its surface. "There will be others, brother monk, others who become lost in the territories between sleeping and waking, between individual consciousness and universal awareness. You will know them by the quality of their stillness and the depth of their seeming absence. Remember what you have learned here, that presence can take many forms, and sometimes the greatest teaching comes from those who appear to be saying nothing at all." Tenzin bowed deeply to this young woman who had become his teacher in the most unexpected way. "Will I see you again, sister?" Yang Chen smiled, her face luminous in the starlight. "You will see me in everyone who learns to love without boundaries, in every consciousness to flow that discovers how like water while remaining stable like stone. You will recognize me in the eyes of those who have touched the source and return to share its gifts with a world that hungers for authentic peace." As they walked back toward the house, she added one final teaching that would guide Tenzin through all the years that followed. "The secret, dear friend, is not to choose between sleeping and waking, between individual awareness and universal consciousness, between human life and divine realization. The secret is to discover that these apparent opposites are like two sides of the same coin, different faces of the same moon, varying expressions of the same infinite love that flows through all things. That night, Tenzin slept more deeply than he ever had before, and his dreams were filled with visions of countless beings learning to navigate the mysterious waters between form and emptiness, time and eternity, individual love and universal compassion. He saw that Yang Chen's story was not unique, but part of a vast tapestry of awakening that was slowly transforming human consciousness itself. When he woke at dawn, he found the ancient stone had returned to his palm, warm and smooth as ever, but somehow different now, as if it had absorbed new layers of wisdom from its time in Yang Chen's care. He understood that he was now its guardian, responsible for passing its teachings on to the next generation of seekers who would need its medicine. The journey back to the mountain monastery felt like traveling between worlds, each step carrying him further from the extraordinary events he had witnessed and closer to the ordinary rhythms of monastic life. But he carried within himself now a secret knowledge that would transform his understanding of everything. The recognition that the sacred and the mundane, the mystical and the practical, the individual and the universal, were not separate realms, but different ways of experiencing the same underlying reality. When the abbot and Tenzin arrived back at the mountain monastery, the autumn leaves were beginning their annual dance of letting go, drifting from the ancient trees like prayers made visible. The familiar sight of the weathered stone buildings and prayer flags should have brought comfort, but Tenzin found himself experiencing a strange disorientation, as if he were seeing his spiritual home through eyes that had been washed clean by experiences too profound for ordinary language. The other monks gathered around them eagerly, hungry for news from the world beyond their mountain sanctuary. But when they asked about their journey, Tenzin found himself struggling to find words that could convey what had transpired in the merchant's house. How could he explain the mystery of a consciousness that had learned to flow between dimensions of awareness? How could he describe the healing that came not from fixing what was broken, but from recognizing that brokenness itself was an illusion? The abbot, observing his young student's difficulty, smiled with the gentle understanding of one who had watched countless seekers grapple with the ineffable nature of profound spiritual experience. Some teachings, he told the assembled community, can only be transmitted through presence rather than words. Young Tenzin carries within him now a wisdom that will unfold gradually, like a flower that blooms according to its own inner timing. In the weeks that followed, Tenzin noticed that his relationship with the monastic routine had transformed completely. The same meditation periods, the same chanting sessions, the same daily work in garden and kitchen continued as always. But now each activity felt imbued with a significance that had previously been invisible to him. He began to recognize that every moment offered the same choice that Yang Chen had faced, whether to remain trapped in the narrow confines of individual awareness or to allow consciousness to expand into its natural state of boundless presence. During morning meditation, instead of struggling with the endless stream of thoughts that had once tormented him, Tenzin found himself resting in the same quality of awareness that he had witnessed in the sleeping girl. His thoughts continued to arise and dissolve, but they no longer seemed like obstacles to peace. They had become like clouds passing through an infinite sky, temporary formations that neither enhanced nor diminished the vast spaciousness in which they appeared. The ancient stone, now permanently warm in his palm during sitting practice, seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, reminding him constantly of the teaching about flowing and stillness. He began to understand that meditation was not about achieving any particular state of consciousness, but about learning to recognize the awareness that was already present already perfect, already at peace, beneath all the apparent turbulence of mental activity. One evening, as the community gathered for the abbot's regular teaching discourse, an unexpected visitor arrived at the monastery gates. She was a middle-aged woman whose eyes held the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone whose suffering seems beyond reach. Her name was Dolkar, and she had traveled for many days from a distant province, carrying with her a story that would test everything Tenzin had learned about the mysterious territories between sleeping and waking. "My son," Dolkar began, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion, "has been lost to us for 3 years now. Not lost in the way of death or departure, but lost in a way that is somehow more heartbreaking. He sits by the window in our home from morning until night, staring at something none of us can see, responding to voices none of us can hear. Sometimes he laughs with pure joy at invisible companions. Other times he weeps for sorrows we cannot fathom." The abbot listened with the same profound attention he had brought to the merchant's tale, his weathered hands folded gently in his lap. "Tell us more about your son's condition, dear mother. When did this change begin? Was there any event that preceded his withdrawal from ordinary interaction?" Dolkar's eyes filled with tears as she recalled the beginning of her family's ordeal. Norbu was always a sensitive child, drawn to beauty in ways that seemed almost painful to him. He could spend hours watching sunlight move across a wall, or listening to the sound of rain on our roof as if it were the most exquisite music. As he grew older, this sensitivity only intensified. He would sometimes come home from the market weeping because he had seen an old dog limping or heard a child crying. She paused, gathering strength to continue her narrative. 3 years ago, during the Festival of Lights, something changed. Norbu was helping to arrange the butter lamps in our family shrine when suddenly he became very still, more motionless than I had ever seen anyone become. He stood there for perhaps an hour, completely absorbed in the flickering flames, and when he finally moved again, it was as if he had become someone else entirely. Tenzin felt the stone in his robes grow warm as recognition dawned. This was another soul who had discovered the doorways between dimensions of consciousness, another being who had touched something so vast that returning to ordinary awareness seemed impossible. From that night forward, Dolkar continued, Norbu began spending more and more time in what we can only describe as communion with invisible presences. He would hold conversations with beings we could not see, participate in ceremonies that existed only in his perception, travel to places that had no physical location. Gradually, he stopped eating regular meals, stopped sleeping in his bed, stopped acknowledging our presence except in the most minimal ways. The woman's voice broke completely as she reached the heart of her anguish. The healers in tried everything. Herbal remedies, ritual our region have purifications, even exorcism ceremonies. But nothing changes. Norbu continues to exist in his own reality, as unreachable as a star in the daytime sky. We can see him, we can touch him, but he might as well be living in another world entirely. The abbot exchanged a meaningful glance with Tenzin, who felt his heart racing with a mixture of recognition and uncertainty. Was this another case like Yangchen's? Could the lessons learned in the merchant's house be applied to this new situation? And if so, what role was he meant to play in whatever healing might be possible? "You have come seeking guidance," the abbot said gently, "but I must ask you to consider a difficult question. Are you certain that your son is lost? Or is it possible that he has found something that exists beyond the boundaries of what we normally consider real?" Dolkar looked startled by this unexpected perspective. "But Venerable Sir, how can a discovery be worthwhile if it separates him from his family, from his responsibilities, from life itself?" "That," the abbot replied with infinite compassion, "is precisely the question that your son may be struggling with. Perhaps he has not lost his way, but has instead found himself standing at a crossroads between two different ways of being conscious. One path leads back to the familiar world of ordinary human interaction. The other leads deeper into territories of awareness that most people never glimpse in their entire lifetimes." He rose from his cushion with fluid grace and gestured for Tenzin to join him. "My young student here has recently learned something about navigating such crossroads. Perhaps together we can offer your son not a cure for his condition, but guidance in learning to walk between worlds without becoming lost in either one." The journey to Dolkar's village took them through landscape that seemed to shift between earthly beauty and something approaching the otherworldly. Mountain passes opened onto valleys that appeared to shimmer with their own inner light. Streams cascaded down rocky slopes with a musical quality that seemed to carry meaning beyond mere sound. Even the air itself felt charged with possibilities that existed just beyond the reach of ordinary perception. During their travels, the abbot shared with Tenzin a series of teachings about what he called the realm of visions, territories of consciousness that existed parallel to ordinary waking awareness but were normally invisible to most people. He explained that certain individuals, often those with naturally sensitive temperaments, could sometimes glimpse these parallel dimensions of reality, and occasionally someone would become so fascinated by what they discovered there that they would begin spending more time in visionary consciousness than in ordinary awareness. The challenge, the abbot explained as they walked along a mountain path that seemed to wind between earth and sky, is not to deny the reality of what these individuals experience, but to help them learn to move fluidly between different levels of consciousness without becoming trapped in any single dimension of awareness. He told Tenzin about the ancient practice of conscious bridging, a method developed by Tibetan masters for working with individuals who had become lost in visionary states. The technique involved not trying to pull such people back into ordinary consciousness, but rather learning to meet them in the liminal spaces they inhabited, and then gradually guiding them toward integration of their visionary experiences with practical daily life. The key, the abbot emphasized, is understanding that consciousness itself is like water. It can take any shape, flow into any container, but it never loses its essential nature. People like Dolkar's son have not lost their minds. They have discovered the fluid nature of awareness itself, but they need guidance in learning to direct that fluidity rather than being swept away by it. When they finally reached Dolkar's village, Tenzin was struck by the way the community seemed to exist in the shadow of one family's mysterious sorrow. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the young man who had become lost in his own inner world. Children were warned to stay away from the house where strange things were said to happen. Even the local dogs seemed to give the family's dwelling a wide berth, as if they sensed something unsettling about the invisible forces that moved through that particular space. Dolkar's home was modest but well kept, with a garden that showed signs of loving care despite the family's ongoing distress. Prayer flags hung from the eaves, their colors faded by mountain weather, but still carrying their ancient messages of compassion and wisdom into the wind. The sound of running water came from somewhere nearby, perhaps a small stream that provided both practical necessity and soothing background music for the household's daily rhythms. But as they approached the front door, Tenzin became aware of something that made the hair on his arms stand up. There was a quality of presence around the house that felt simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. It reminded him of the atmosphere in certain sacred places he had visited. Caves where great masters had meditated. Temples where profound realizations had occurred. Natural formations that seemed to exist at the intersection between ordinary reality and something far more mysterious. Dolkar led them inside with the careful movements of someone who had learned to navigate around invisible obstacles. The interior of the house felt charged with the same strange energy that surrounded it, as if the very air was pregnant with possibilities that existed just beyond the threshold of normal perception. Butter lamps flickered on small altars throughout the rooms, their gentle flames creating dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. And there, in a room that faced east toward the rising sun, sat Norbu. Tenzin's first impression was of someone who had become translucent, as if the boundaries between his physical form and the space around him had begun to dissolve. Norbu appeared to be perhaps 20 years old, with features that carried an otherworldly beauty reminiscent of the classical depictions of bodhisattvas in temple art. His eyes were open, but focused on something far beyond the room's physical walls. His breathing was so subtle it was barely detectable, and his entire being seemed to emanate the same quality of profound stillness that Tenzin had learned to associate with the deepest states of meditation. But what was most remarkable about Norbu's presence was the sense of activity that surrounded his apparent immobility. Though he sat perfectly still, the space around him seemed alive with movement, as if invisible currents of energy were flowing through dimensions that existed parallel to ordinary physical reality. Occasionally he would smile at something unseen, or nod as if responding to unheard communications, or reach out with one hand to touch something that wasn't there. "He's been like this for hours," Dolkar whispered, her voice heavy with the exhaustion of someone who had spent 3 years watching her beloved child exist in a reality she couldn't access. "Sometimes he'll eat a few bites of food if I place it directly in his hands, but most of the time he seems to be nourished by something we can't see." The abbot approached Norbu with the same reverence he had shown when working with Yangchen, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid disturbing whatever delicate processes were taking place in the young man's expanded consciousness. He knelt beside the motionless figure and placed his hand over Norbu's heart, not quite touching, but close enough to sense the subtle rhythms of his being. What followed was a period of profound stillness that seemed to stretch beyond ordinary time. The abbot remained in this position of deep listening for what might have been minutes or hours. In that charged atmosphere, normal temporal boundaries seemed to lose their meaning. Tenzin found himself naturally settling into meditation posture, allowing his own consciousness to expand and become receptive to whatever teachings might emerge from this encounter. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the quality of presence in the room began to shift. It was as if invisible doors were opening, creating bridges between the dimension of consciousness that Norbu inhabited and the ordinary awareness that the rest of them shared. The air itself seemed to become more transparent, allowing glimpses of the visionary realm where the young man had been dwelling. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from vast distances while simultaneously emerging from the deepest intimacy, Norbu began to speak. "The teachers are here," he said, his words carrying harmonics that resonated in the bones rather than the ears. "They've been waiting for someone who could hear them, someone who could serve as a bridge between their realm and this one. They have so much to share, so much wisdom that could help heal the suffering of this world." The abbot's eyes opened, and Tenzin saw in them the same recognition he had witnessed during Yang Chen's awakening. This was not madness or illness, but a form of expanded consciousness that had simply grown beyond the boundaries of ordinary individual awareness. "Tell us about these teachers," the abbot said softly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to communicate across dimensions of consciousness. "What have they been showing you during your time in their realm?" Norbu's face, illuminated with joy so radiant it seemed to fill the entire room with golden light. "They've been teaching me about the nature of compassion that exists beyond individual identity," he replied, his words flowing with the fluidity of someone describing a landscape they knew intimately. "They've shown me how love can become so vast that it transcends the boundaries between self and other, how awareness can expand until it encompasses all of existence." He paused, his eyes focusing briefly on the abbot's face, before drifting back to the invisible realm that held most of his attention. "But they've also been showing me something else, something that has kept me here so long. They've been demonstrating how this expanded awareness can be brought back into ordinary life, how the wisdom they share can be translated into forms that can help heal the suffering of beings who are still trapped in the illusion of separation." Tenzin felt the ancient stone in his robes pulse with warmth as understanding began to dawn. This was the same challenge that Yang Chen had faced, learning to integrate profound spiritual realization with practical human existence. Norbu had discovered realms of consciousness that offered extraordinary wisdom, but he had become so absorbed in receiving these teachings that he had forgotten how to function in ordinary reality. "The teachers are saying," Norbu continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone translating complex concepts from one language to another, "that the time has come for me to learn the art of conscious bridging. They want me to discover how to move fluidly between their awareness and the dimension of world of form so that I can serve as a conduit for their healing wisdom." The abbot smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully diagnosed a complex spiritual condition. "And are you ready to learn this art of bridging, young visionary? Are you prepared to discover how to honor both the extraordinary realm you've been exploring and the ordinary world that your family inhabits?" For the first time in 3 years, Norbu's gaze fully focused on something in the physical realm around him. His eyes met the abbot's with a clarity that spoke of profound intelligence, operating behind his otherworldly absorption. "Yes," he said simply, "the teachers have been preparing me for this moment. They knew that eventually guides would come who could help me learn to walk between worlds without becoming lost in either one." What unfolded over the following days was perhaps the most extraordinary teaching demonstration Tenzin had ever witnessed. The abbot worked with Norbu using techniques that seemed to blend ancient wisdom with spontaneous innovation, creating a unique healing process tailored specifically to this individual's particular form of expanded consciousness. The method involved what the abbot called graduated grounding, a process of gradually increasing Norbu's connection to physical reality, while simultaneously honoring and integrating the visionary experiences that had become his primary focus. Rather than trying to pull him completely out of his expanded state, the abbot helped him learn to maintain awareness of both dimensions simultaneously. The first step was establishing what they termed anchor points, specific times throughout each day when Norbu would intentionally focus his attention on simple physical activities. These might include drinking a cup of tea while remaining fully present to its taste and temperature, walking in the garden while feeling his feet making contact with the earth, or engaging in brief conversations with family members while maintaining awareness of their emotional states. Initially, These anchor points lasted only a few minutes before Norbu's attention would drift back to the visionary realm. But gradually, as he learned to trust that his connection to the invisible teachers would not be lost by engaging with ordinary reality, he began to spend longer periods in grounded awareness. The breakthrough came when Norbu realized that his visionary experiences actually became richer and more meaningful when they were balanced with periods of ordinary consciousness. The teachings he received from his invisible guides took on greater depth and practical applicability when he had regular contact with the human world they were meant to serve. "It's like learning to breathe," Norbu explained to Tenzin during one of their conversations. "I was trying to hold my breath in the realm of expanded consciousness, afraid that if I exhaled back into ordinary awareness, I would lose everything I had gained. But now I understand that consciousness is meant to flow like breathing, expanding into vast dimensions and then contracting back into focused presence over and over again in a natural rhythm." The ancient stone played a crucial role in this healing process. Tenzin would place it in Norbu's palm during the anchor point exercises, and its accumulated wisdom seemed to provide a stabilizing influence that helped the young visionary maintain connection to physical reality while still accessing the expanded states that had become his natural habitat. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Norbu's recovery was the way it transformed not only his own life, but the entire atmosphere of his family's household. As he learned to integrate his visionary experiences with ordinary consciousness, the wisdom he had received from his invisible teachers began to manifest in practical ways that benefited everyone around him. He developed an almost supernatural ability to sense what people needed for healing. Sometimes it was simply the gift of being truly seen and heard. Other times it involved specific guidance about life challenges they were facing. His mother, Dolkar, found herself receiving insights about her own spiritual development through conversations with her son that seemed to flow from sources of wisdom far beyond his 20 years of ordinary life experience. The house that had once felt charged with unsettling energy became a place of profound peace where neighbors began coming to seek guidance and comfort. Norbu's gift for bridging between dimensions of consciousness had evolved into a natural capacity for helping others access their own inner wisdom and healing potential. As their time in the village drew to a close, Tenzin realized that he had witnessed something unprecedented in his experience of Buddhist teaching. He had seen how individual spiritual realization could become a gift that served an entire community, how personal healing could ripple outward to touch countless other lives in ways that were both subtle and profound. The night before their departure, Norbu asked to speak privately with Tenzin in the family garden. They walked among beds of vegetables and medicinal herbs that seemed to glow with their own inner vitality in the moonlight. And Tenzin found himself wondering if his own perception had been permanently altered by exposure to these extraordinary healing processes. "The teachers want me to give you something," Norbu said, reaching into his robes and withdrawing an object that made Tenzin gasp with amazement. It was another stone, similar to the ancient one he carried, but somehow different. This one seemed to pulse with living light, as if it contained the essence of stars rather than merely reflecting earthly illumination. "This is a bridge stone," Norbu explained, placing the luminous object in Tenzin's palm. "It carries the wisdom of conscious bridging between dimensions of awareness. The teachers say that you will encounter others who have become lost in expanded consciousness, and this stone will help you guide them back to integration rather than forcing them to choose between mystical experience and ordinary life." Tenzin felt the new stone's warmth merging with the familiar heat of his ancient teacher, creating a sensation of completeness that seemed to resonate through every cell of his being. Will I know when to use it? Will I recognize the situations where this kind of healing is needed? Norbu smiled with the radiant joy that had become his natural expression since learning to bridge between worlds. You'll know, brother monk. The stone will grow warm when you encounter consciousness that has expanded beyond its current ability to integrate. And more importantly, your own heart will recognize the particular quality of stillness that indicates someone is dwelling between dimensions of awareness. As they prepared to leave the village the next morning, Dolkar approached Tenzin with tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "You've given me back my son," she said. "But more than that, you've helped him become someone I never could have imagined. A bridge between heaven and earth, a translator of wisdom that comes from realms I'll never see." The abbot placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder. "Your son was always destined for this role," he said softly. The apparent illness was actually a form of spiritual initiation that prepared him to serve others in ways that conventional life could never have taught him. Your love and patience during his time of transformation were essential parts of the healing process. The journey back to the monastery felt like traveling between dimensions of reality themselves, each step carrying them from the miraculous back toward the ordinary. Yet somehow the ordinary had been permanently transformed by exposure to the extraordinary. Tenzin found himself seeing the familiar landscape with new eyes, recognizing that every rock and tree and cloud existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions of consciousness. The two stones in his robes seemed to pulse in harmony with each other, creating a constant reminder of the teachings he had received about the fluid nature of awareness and the possibility of bridging between different levels of spiritual experience. He understood now that his role as a monk involved not just personal spiritual development, but serving as a guide for others who might become lost in the vast territories of expanded consciousness. As they climbed the final mountain pass that would bring them within sight of their home monastery, the abbot turned to Tenzin with an expression of profound satisfaction. "You have learned something that few monks ever discover," he said, his voice carrying the weight of recognition and approval. "You have seen that enlightenment is not a destination to be reached, but a capacity to be developed. The ability to move consciously between different dimensions of awareness while remaining grounded in compassion for all beings." The ancient buildings of their mountain sanctuary came into view as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Prayer flags streaming in the wind like visible mantras, carrying blessings to all directions. But Tenzin knew that he was returning, not as the same young monk who had left weeks earlier, but as someone who had been forever changed by witnessing the extraordinary healing that becomes possible when wisdom and compassion learn to dance together in service to consciousness itself. That night, as he settled into his familiar meditation cushion in the monastery's main hall, Tenzin held both stones in his palms and felt their combined warmth spreading through his entire being. Around him, his fellow monks sat in their own practice, each following their individual path toward awakening. But he knew now that awakening itself was not an individual achievement, but a collective flowering of consciousness that touched all beings when even one person learned to bridge successfully between the mystical and the mundane. The teachings he had received during their extraordinary journey began to settle into his understanding like seeds finding fertile ground. He realized that the stories of Yang Chen and Norbu were not isolated incidents, but examples of a transformation in human consciousness itself, a growing capacity to access expanded awareness while remaining functional and compassionate in ordinary reality. As sleep began to claim him that night, Tenzin found himself drifting into dreams that felt more like visions, where he could see countless individuals around the world, learning to navigate the territories between sleeping and waking, between individual identity and universal consciousness, between mystical experience and practical service to others. In these dreams, he witnessed the gradual emergence of a new way of being human, one that honored both the heights of spiritual realization and the depths of compassionate engagement with the world's suffering. He saw that his own journey was part of a vast awakening that was slowly transforming the entire fabric of human experience, creating possibilities for healing and integration that previous generations could never have imagined. And in the deepest layers of these visionary dreams, he heard the whispered promise that these stories of healing and transformation would continue to unfold, touching the lives of countless beings who yearned for the peace that comes from learning to rest in the flowing stillness of consciousness itself, forever bridging between the sacred and the ordinary, the mystical and the mundane, the individual and the infinite. The soft sound of temple bells drifted through the mountain air as Tenzin settled into what would become his new role within the monastery community. Word of the extraordinary healings he had witnessed began to spread through whispered conversations between monks during their daily work periods, creating ripples of curiosity and wonder that reached far beyond the ancient stone walls of their mountain sanctuary. Within months of their return, seekers began arriving at the monastery gates with stories that echoed the patterns Tenzin had learned to recognize. There was the merchant's wife who had fallen into such profound states of compassion that she could no longer function in ordinary society, spending her days weeping for the suffering of every creature she encountered. A young scholar arrived carrying tales of his brother who had become lost in philosophical contemplation, so deep that he forgot to eat or sleep, existing in a realm of pure abstract thought that seemed more real to him than physical reality. Each visitor brought their own unique variation of the same underlying theme: consciousness that had expanded beyond its current capacity for integration, awareness that had touched something so vast it couldn't find its way back to practical engagement with everyday life. Tenzin found himself naturally drawn to these cases, his heart recognizing the particular quality of stillness that indicated someone dwelling between dimensions of awareness. The abbot, observing his young students' growing expertise in these matters, began formally training him in what the monastery's ancient texts referred to as the art of conscious midwifery, the delicate skill of helping souls birth themselves from one level of awareness into another without losing the gifts they had discovered along the way. You see, the abbot explained during one of their evening instruction sessions, consciousness is like water seeking its own level. Sometimes it pools in the high mountain lakes of mystical experience, and sometimes it flows down into the valleys of ordinary life. Our role is not to dam these flows or redirect them, but to help them find their natural course toward the ocean of integrated awareness. The training involved learning to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when someone had become temporarily lost in expanded consciousness. There were physical markers, a particular quality of stillness in the body, breathing patterns that had become synchronized with rhythms deeper than ordinary respiration, eyes that seemed to be gazing through veils of ordinary reality into something far more profound. But more importantly, there were energetic signatures that Tenzin learned to perceive through what the abbot called the wisdom eye. a capacity to sense the invisible currents of consciousness that flowed around and through every individual. People who had become lost in expanded awareness carried with them a particular luminosity, as if they were generating light from some internal source that existed beyond the reach of ordinary perception. The techniques for working with such individuals required extraordinary patience and sensitivity. The fundamental principle was always the same. Never try to pull someone back into ordinary consciousness, but instead learn to meet them in the liminal spaces they inhabited, and then gradually guide them toward integration of their expanded experiences with practical daily life. This process often began with what the abbot termed resonant breathing, synchronizing one's own respiratory rhythm with that of the person who had become lost in mystical states. Through this simple but profound practice, a bridge of shared consciousness could be established that allowed communication across dimensions of awareness that were normally separated by the boundaries of individual identity. Tenzin discovered that the two stones he now carried, the ancient teacher stone and the luminous bridge stone, played crucial roles in facilitating these connections. When held during the resonant breathing process, they seemed to create a stabilizing field that made it safer for expanded consciousness to begin exploring the possibility of returning to more grounded states of awareness. One particularly challenging case arrived in the form of an elderly woman named Pema, whose granddaughter had brought her to the monastery after months of increasingly concerning behavior. The old woman had begun claiming that she could communicate directly with deceased relatives, spending hours in animated conversation with invisible presences that seemed completely real to her. At first, the granddaughter explained to Tenzin and the abbot, "We thought grandmother was simply grieving the loss of grandfather, who died last spring. But these conversations have become so detailed and specific that they're affecting her ability to take care of herself. She prepares meals for people who aren't there, saves portions of food for visitors only she can see, and sometimes stays awake all night hosting elaborate gatherings with the spirits of our ancestors." The case presented unique challenges because the old woman's expanded consciousness seemed to be specifically focused on communication with beings who existed in what she described as the realm of the ancestors, a dimension of awareness where the spirits of deceased family members continued to exist in forms that were invisible to ordinary perception, but completely tangible to her. When Tenzin first met Pema, he was struck by the quality of joy that radiated from her weathered features. Unlike the cases of Yang Chen and Norbu, where expanded consciousness had created a kind of withdrawal from ordinary life, this elderly woman seemed energized and delighted by her ability to maintain contact with loved ones who had passed beyond the veil of physical existence. "They're all here," she told him with the enthusiasm of someone sharing wonderful news. "My husband, my parents, my sister who died when we were children. They've all been waiting for me to develop the ability to see and hear them clearly. They have so much to tell me about the continuation of consciousness beyond physical death, so many reassurances to offer about the nature of eternal love." The challenge was not that Pema's experiences were causing her distress, but rather that her complete absorption in communication with the ancestral realm was preventing her from maintaining the practical activities necessary for physical survival. She had begun to see her body and its needs as increasingly irrelevant compared to the profound spiritual connection she was experiencing. Working with her required Tenzin to develop new approaches to the art of conscious bridging. Instead of helping someone integrate mystical experiences with ordinary life, he needed to help Pema understand that caring for her physical existence was itself a form of spiritual practice that honored both the living and the dead. The breakthrough came when Tenzin realized that the old woman's deceased relatives were actually trying to communicate the same message through their conversations with her. During one of the resonant breathing sessions, he found himself somehow able to perceive the subtle presence of the ancestral beings Pima was communicating with. And he understood that they were encouraging her to maintain her connection to physical life, rather than abandoning it in favor of exclusive focus on the spiritual realm. "Your grandfather is saying," Tenzin found himself translating during one of their sessions, "that the greatest gift you can offer to the ancestors is to live fully and joyfully in the physical world they can no longer directly experience. He wants you to eat delicious food, enjoy the warmth of sunlight, feel the satisfaction of caring for your body, not as a departure from spiritual connection, but as a way of sharing the pleasures of embodied existence with those who can now only experience them through your awareness." This reframing of physical care as a form of ancestral service provided Pima with a bridge between her expanded consciousness and practical daily life. She began to understand that maintaining her health and engaging with her living family members was not a distraction from spiritual communication, but an essential part of honoring the wisdom her deceased relatives were trying to share with her. Over the course of several weeks, Pima learned to schedule specific times for deep communication with the ancestral realm, while also maintaining regular periods of grounded engagement with ordinary reality. She discovered that her conversations with deceased relatives actually became richer and more meaningful when they were balanced with full participation in the world of the living. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Instead of becoming a burden on her family due to her otherworldly absorption, Pima evolved into a source of wisdom and guidance who could offer insights that seemed to flow from generations of accumulated understanding. Her ability to bridge between the realm of the ancestors and the world of the living became a gift that served her entire community. Young couples would come to her for guidance about marriage, drawing on the relationship wisdom she channeled from ancestors who had navigated decades of partnership. Parents struggling with difficult children would seek her counsel, receiving practical advice that seemed to emerge from the collective parenting experience of countless previous generations. Most remarkably, people who were grieving the loss of their own family members began visiting Pima, finding comfort in her ability to facilitate a sense of ongoing connection with their deceased loved ones. She never claimed to be a medium or psychic, but simply someone who had learned to perceive the continuity of love that transcends physical death. As word of these extraordinary healing successes spread beyond the monastery, Tenzin found himself being called to work with increasingly complex cases of expanded consciousness. There was the artist who had become so absorbed in visionary inspiration that he painted continuously for days without rest, creating works of startling beauty while his physical health deteriorated from neglect. A young mother arrived seeking help for her teenage daughter, who had developed the ability to perceive the emotional states of everyone around her with such intensity that she could no longer attend school or participate in normal social activities. The daughter's empathic sensitivity had grown so acute that being in crowds felt like drowning in an ocean of other people's feelings. Each case required Tenzin to develop new variations on the fundamental principles of conscious bridging, learning to work with the unique ways that individual consciousness could expand beyond its current capacity for integration. The bridge stone seemed to pulse with different qualities of warmth, depending on the specific type of guidance each situation required. Through this work, Tenzin began to understand that what he was witnessing was not a collection of isolated incidents, but rather expressions of a larger transformation in human consciousness itself. More and more individuals were spontaneously accessing expanded states of awareness, but many lacked the guidance necessary to integrate these experiences with practical daily life. The monastery gradually evolved into an informal training center where people could learn the art of conscious bridging, both for their own spiritual development and to help others who might become lost in the vast territories of mystical experience. The abbot formalized these teachings into what became known as the Path of Integration, a comprehensive approach to spiritual development that honored both transcendent realization and embodied service. Students came from distant lands to study these methods, carrying the teachings back to their own communities where they established networks of support for individuals experiencing spontaneous spiritual emergence. The ancient wisdom that had once been preserved within isolated mountain monasteries began flowing into the world like streams converging into rivers, eventually reaching oceans of human consciousness that hungered for authentic guidance in navigating the mysteries of expanded awareness. But perhaps the most profound aspect of this work was the way it transformed Tenzin's own understanding of the spiritual path. He realized that enlightenment was not a personal achievement to be attained through individual effort, but rather a collaborative flowering of consciousness that emerged when communities learned to support each other's journey between the mystical and the mundane. The stones he carried had become more than teaching tools. They were symbols of a lineage of wisdom that passed from teacher to student, from healer to healed, from one generation to the next, in an unbroken chain of compassionate service to the evolution of consciousness itself. Each person who learned to bridge successfully between dimensions of awareness became a link in this chain, offering their own unique gifts to the collective awakening of humanity. Years flowed by like water over the ancient stones, and Tenzin's hair began showing the first silver threads that marked the passage from student to teacher, from seeker to guide. The monastery had become renowned throughout the region as a place where the most mysterious ailments of the soul could find healing, where consciousness that had expanded beyond ordinary boundaries could learn to integrate its gifts with practical service to the world. One autumn evening, as the mountain peaks blazed with the colors of changing seasons and prayer flags danced in the crisp air, a familiar figure appeared was Yangchen, now at the monastery gates. It woman in her 30s, carrying herself with the serene dignity of someone who had long ago learned to walk gracefully between worlds. She had come, she explained to the gathered community, to share news of a remarkable discovery. In her travels as a bridge worker, helping others integrate mystical experiences with ordinary life, she had encountered evidence of what appeared to be a global awakening. Individuals all over the world were spontaneously accessing expanded states of consciousness and learning to integrate them with practical daily existence. It's as if humanity is collectively remembering something it had forgotten, Yangchen explained during the evening teaching session. People everywhere are discovering that consciousness is far more fluid and expansive than our cultures have taught us to believe. And more importantly, they're learning that this expanded awareness can be a gift to serve others rather than a private achievement to be hoarded. She had established a network of bridge workers who traveled from community to community, offering guidance to individuals experiencing spontaneous spiritual emergence. These teachers carried with them stones similar to the ones Tenzin held, objects that had been blessed and charged with the accumulated wisdom of countless healing encounters. The network had developed methods for training ordinary people to recognize the signs of expanded consciousness in their family members and friends, offering basic techniques for providing support during periods of spiritual emergence. Communities that had once feared or rejected individuals with mystical experiences were learning to see them as potential sources of wisdom and healing. We're witnessing the birth of a new way of being human, Yang Chen concluded, her eyes reflecting the depth of someone who had seen far beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception. A way that honors both the heights of spiritual realization and the depths of compassionate engagement with the world's needs. The bridge between heaven and earth is being built one consciousness at a time. As the evening drew to a close, and the community settled into the peaceful rhythms of nighttime meditation, Tenzin found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with his own struggle to find inner peace. The smooth stone that had once helped him learn to allow thoughts to flow like water over rock had become the foundation for a lifetime of service to others seeking the same integration. He understood now that his initial difficulties with meditation had not been obstacles to overcome, but preparations for the work he would eventually be called to do. Every challenge he had faced in learning to navigate his own consciousness had equipped him to guide others through similar territories of expanded awareness. The ancient teaching hall filled with the soft sound of synchronized breathing as dozens of practitioners settled into their evening meditation. Some were monks who had dedicated their lives to spiritual development. Others were visitors seeking healing for various forms of consciousness that had expanded beyond their current ability to integrate. All of them, Tenzin realized, were participating in the same fundamental process, learning to rest in the flowing stillness of awareness itself, discovering how to be fully present to whatever arose in consciousness without being overwhelmed or swept away by its intensity. Whether someone was struggling with ordinary thoughts and emotions, or navigating the vast territories of mystical experience, the was always the same. Underlying medicine, the cultivationist acceptance of space that could hold everything without being disturbed by anything. As sleep began to claim him that night, Tenzin felt the familiar warmth of the stones in his palm and allowed his consciousness to drift into the liminal spaces between waking and dreaming. In these threshold regions, he often received insights and guidance about the healing work that awaited him. Visions of individuals who would soon arrive seeking help with their own journeys between dimensions of awareness. Tonight, his dreams were filled with images of a vast web of light connecting countless beings who had learned to bridge between the mystical and the mundane. Each point of light represented someone who had transformed their own spiritual challenges into gifts of service to others. The web stretched across continents and cultures, creating a network of support for humanity's gradual awakening to its own infinite potential. In the deepest layers of these visionary dreams, Tenzin heard the whispered promise that had guided his work from the beginning, that consciousness itself was evolving, learning to flow more freely between different dimensions of awareness, while remaining grounded in compassion for all beings. The stories of healing and transformation would continue to unfold, touching countless lives with the medicine of integrated awakening, and in the gentle rhythm of his sleeping breath, the ancient stones pulsed with the accumulated wisdom of generations of teachers who had dedicated their lives to serving the evolution of consciousness itself, forever bridging between the sacred and the ordinary, the individual and the infinite, the dreaming and the awakened state that embraced them all. The first light of dawn was filtering through the monastery windows when Tenzin stirred from his profound sleep. But what awakened him was not the familiar sound of morning bells. Instead, it was the sensation of the stones in his palm pulsing with an urgency he had never felt before. The ancient teacher stone and the luminous bridge stone seemed to be resonating with something approaching from far across the mountain valleys, a consciousness so expanded and so lost that it was calling out across vast distances for help. Within hours, a messenger arrived at the monastery gates, his clothes torn from desperate travel through treacherous mountain passes. He carried news that made the abbot's weathered face grow grave with concern. In the distant kingdom of Bhutan, something unprecedented was occurring. An entire village had fallen into what could only be described as collective expanded consciousness. It began with the children, the messenger explained, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and fear. One morning, every child in the village under the age of 15 simply stopped. They didn't fall asleep. They didn't become ill. They became perfectly still, as if they were all listening to the same invisible voice, seeing the same unseen vision. The abbot exchanged a meaningful glance with Tenzin. They had worked with individual cases of expanded consciousness, but never had they encountered an entire community affected simultaneously. This represented a new frontier in the evolution of human awareness, and potentially one of the most dangerous. Within days, the messenger continued, the children's parents began joining them in this strange stillness. Then the elderly, then the village healers and wise women. Now the entire population exists in some kind of shared trance. They breathe in perfect unison. They move with coordinated precision when they move at all. And sometimes they speak in voices that seem to come from somewhere far beyond their individual minds. The description sent chills through Tenzin's understanding. This sounded like consciousness expansion on a scale that could fundamentally alter the fabric of human community itself. If an entire village could slip simultaneously into expanded awareness, what prevented this phenomenon from spreading to neighboring communities, to entire regions, to the world itself? The most disturbing aspect, the messenger added, his voice dropping to a whisper, is that they appear to be happy. Profoundly, radiantly happy in a way that makes it impossible to believe they are suffering from any kind of illness or possession. They seem to exist in a state of continuous bliss, as if they have discovered some secret source of joy that the rest of us cannot access. This detail made the situation even more complex. When individuals became lost in expanded consciousness, they often appeared peaceful or even euphoric to outside observers. But collective expansion of this magnitude raised questions about the nature of individual identity itself. Were these people still individuals? Or had they somehow merged into a group consciousness that transcended personal boundaries? The abbot rose from his cushion with the decisive movement of someone who had spent decades responding to spiritual emergencies. "We must go immediately," he declared. "If what you describe is accurate, we may be witnessing either the most beautiful flowering of collective awakening in human history or the most dangerous dissolution of individual consciousness ever recorded. Either way, our guidance may be desperately needed." Preparations for the journey began immediately. This would require not just Tenzin and the abbot, but a small team of the monastery's most experienced practitioners of conscious bridging. They gathered supplies for what might be an extended stay, including special meditation cushions designed for group practice, incense that could help stabilize atmospheric conditions during intensive spiritual work, and a collection of bridge stones that had been charged with healing energy over many years of use. Most importantly, they prepared themselves mentally and spiritually for an encounter unlike anything in their previous experience. Working with individual expanded consciousness required patience, sensitivity, and skill. working with an entire community that had simultaneously transcended ordinary awareness, would demand resources of wisdom and compassion that they had never before been called upon to access. The journey to the affected village took them through some of the most remote and challenging terrain in the Himalayas. Mountain passes that were barely wide enough for human passage, valleys where the air grew thin enough to make breathing difficult, rivers that had to be crossed on bridges made of woven vines that swayed terrifyingly in the mountain winds. But as they traveled, Tenzin began to notice something remarkable about the landscape itself. The closer they came to their destination, the more the natural world seemed to vibrate with an unusual quality of aliveness. Birds sang with harmonies that seemed almost orchestrated. Flowers bloomed with colors more vivid than ordinary perception typically registered, and even the rocks and trees appeared to shimmer with an inner luminosity. "Do you feel it?" the abbot asked during one of their rest stops, gesturing toward the extraordinary beauty that surrounded them. "Whatever is happening in that village is affecting the entire region. Consciousness expansion of this magnitude creates ripple effects that extend far beyond the individuals directly involved." The implications were staggering. If collective expanded consciousness could influence the natural environment itself, then what they were approaching represented something far more significant than a localized spiritual phenomenon. They might be witnessing the emergence of a new form of human awareness that could potentially transform the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. As they crested the final mountain ridge that would bring the village into view, Tenzin felt both stones in his possession begin to pulse with such intensity that they seemed to be generating their own heat. Whatever lay beyond that ridge was calling to them with the magnetic pull of consciousness, recognizing consciousness across vast distances of both space and awareness. The village, when it finally came into view, was unlike anything any of them had ever seen. From their elevated vantage point, they could observe the entire community spread out below them like a living mandala. Every person in the settlement, men, women, children, elderly, was positioned in perfect geometric relationships to every other person, creating patterns that seemed to pulse with mathematical precision. But what was most extraordinary was the quality of light that emanated from the village itself. It was as if each individual was generating a subtle luminosity that combined with all the others to create a field of radiance that was visible even in the bright mountain sunlight. The entire community appeared to be breathing as a single organism, their individual chest movements synchronized into one vast respiratory rhythm. "They've achieved something that most spiritual traditions consider mythical," the abbot whispered, his voice filled with awe and concern in equal measure. "They appear to have dissolved the boundaries between individual consciousness and merged into what the ancient texts describe as unity awareness. But the question remains, is this a blessing or a catastrophe?" The descent into the village required extraordinary care. As they drew closer to the field of expanded consciousness that surrounded the community, each member of their group began to feel their own awareness being pulled toward the same state of expanded unity that had claimed the villagers. It was like walking into a powerful magnetic field that affected consciousness rather than metal. Tenzin found himself needing to grip the bridge stones tightly to maintain his individual awareness as they approached the first buildings of the settlement. The pull toward merging with the collective consciousness was almost irresistible, offering glimpses of bliss and understanding that made ordinary individual existence seem cramped and limited by comparison. The villagers themselves seemed aware of the approaching visitors without needing to look in their direction. As the group of monks entered the main square, every person in the community turned simultaneously toward them, with expressions of such radiant welcome that it felt like being embraced by a vast family of light beings. But when they spoke, it was not as individuals addressing other individuals. Instead, their voices harmonized into a single collective voice that seemed to emerge from the unified field of their shared consciousness, rather than from any particular throat or mouth. "Welcome, bridge builders," the collective voice said, its tone carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions of hearing that ordinary conversation never accessed. "We have been waiting for guides who could help us understand what we have become and what we are meant to do with this gift we have received." The abbot approached the center of the village square with the same reverence he had shown when working with individual cases of expanded consciousness. But here, instead of kneeling beside a single person, he found himself addressing an entire community that had somehow become a single entity while still maintaining the physical forms of separate individuals. "Tell us," he said, his voice carrying across the square with unusual clarity, "how did this transformation begin? What were the circumstances that led to your collective awakening?" The response came not from any single villager, but seemed to emerge from the space between them, as if the air itself had learned to speak. It began with the children during the Festival of Lights. As they sat together watching the butter lamps flicker in our temple, something shifted in their awareness. They began to see the flames not as separate lights, but as individual expressions of a single luminous essence. The collective voice paused, and Tenzin could sense vast depths of meaning being processed through the unified consciousness before the explanation continued. The children's realization created a resonance that spread to their parents, then to the elders, then to every member of our community. We discovered that individual consciousness is like individual waves on the surface of an infinite ocean. When we stopped identifying with being separate waves and recognized ourselves as expressions of the ocean itself, the boundaries between us naturally dissolved. This description aligned with the highest teachings of Buddhist philosophy about the illusory nature of separate selfhood. But what the villagers had achieved was not merely intellectual understanding. They had somehow collectively transcended the experience of individual identity while maintaining their capacity for coordinated physical existence. "And how do you experience daily life in this state?" the abbot inquired. "How do you make decisions, care for your physical needs, maintain the practical activities necessary for community survival?" The response revealed the remarkable sophistication of their collective awareness. "We function as a single organism with many parts," the unified voice explained. "When food preparation is needed, those whose bodies are most suited to cooking naturally move toward the kitchen areas. When children require care, those whose hearts hold the strongest parental instincts respond automatically. Decision-making occurs through a process of collective intuition that arises spontaneously from our shared wisdom. But, as impressive as this collective consciousness appeared to be, Tenzin began to perceive subtle signs of imbalance that suggested the community's transformation was not yet complete. While they had successfully merged their individual awareness into unified consciousness, they seemed to have lost something essential in the process. The capacity for individual creative expression, personal growth through challenge, and the dynamic tension that drives evolution and innovation. The village had achieved perfect harmony, but it was the harmony of a still pond rather than a flowing river. There was profound peace, but little movement, deep unity, but limited diversity of expression. It was as if consciousness had flowed so completely into the experience of oneness that it had forgotten how to dance with the creative possibilities that emerge from the interplay between unity and multiplicity. Over the following days, the team of monks worked with the village using techniques that had never before been applied to collective consciousness. The challenge was not helping individuals integrate expanded awareness with life, but helping ordinary, a unified collective consciousness learn to honor both unity and diversity, both merger and individuality. The process required developing entirely new approaches to conscious bridging. Instead of working with single individuals, they found themselves facilitating dialogue between the collective consciousness and the dormant individual awarenesses that still existed within each villager, like seeds waiting for the right conditions to sprout. The breakthrough came when Tenzin realized that the bridge stones could be used not just to stabilize individual consciousness, but to create resonant fields that allowed unified awareness to experience itself from multiple perspectives simultaneously. By placing the stones in specific geometric patterns around the village, they created what amounted to a consciousness laboratory where the collective could experiment with different ways of organizing its awareness. "You have achieved something magnificent," the abbot explained to the assembled community. "You have discovered the ocean of unified consciousness that mystics have sought for millennia. But an ocean without waves is static, lifeless. The art of complete awakening involves learning to be simultaneously the ocean and the waves, the unity and the diversity, the one and the many." What unfolded was perhaps the most extraordinary spiritual teaching demonstration ever witnessed. The village consciousness began to learn how to differentiate itself back into individual expressions while maintaining its underlying unity. People started to speak with their own voices again while remaining connected to the collective wisdom. Children resumed playing as individuals while carrying the deep peace of unified awareness in their hearts. But they had not simply returned to their previous state of ordinary consciousness. Instead, they had achieved something unprecedented in human experience: the ability to flow fluidly between individual and collective awareness as circumstances required. They could merge into unified decision-making when facing community challenges, then differentiate back into individual creativity when personal expression served the common good. The village became a living laboratory for the evolution of human consciousness itself, demonstrating possibilities for collective awakening that honored both the heights of mystical realization and the practical requirements of embodied existence. Word of their achievement began to spread to neighboring communities, creating networks of interest in collective consciousness development that would eventually span continents. As the months passed and the village stabilized in its new form of fluid, collective individual awareness, Tenzin understood that they had witnessed the birth of a new stage in human evolution. The future would bring not just individual enlightenment, but communities that could access unified consciousness while maintaining the creative diversity that drives continued growth and innovation. The bridge stones had become more than healing tools. They were instruments for facilitating humanity's gradual awakening to its own infinite potential for conscious evolution. Each person who learned to flow between individual and collective awareness became a seed for similar transformations in their own communities, creating an ever-expanding network of awakened consciousness. Years later, as Tenzin's hair turned completely silver and his role shifted from active bridge worker to elder teacher, he would look back on the village transformation as the moment when humanity's spiritual evolution accelerated beyond anything previous generations could have imagined. The ancient prophecies spoke of times when consciousness itself would flower into new forms of organization, and he had been privileged to witness the first blossoming of that extraordinary transformation. The stories of healing and awakening continued to unfold, each one adding new layers to the growing understanding of consciousness as an infinitely creative force that could organize itself in ways that served both individual fulfillment and collective flourishing. The bridge between the mystical and the mundane had become a highway for the evolution of awareness itself. And as sleep began to weave its gentle threads through Tenzin's consciousness on that final night in the transformed village, he found himself drifting into a dream that felt more like a prophecy than ordinary slumber. In this vision, he saw countless streams of light flowing across the earth like luminous rivers, each stream representing another community, learning to dance between individual awareness and collective wisdom. The dream carried him forward through time, showing him glimpses of what humanity might become when consciousness learned to flow as freely as water, taking whatever form served the highest good while never losing its essential nature. He witnessed cities where buildings seemed to breathe with shared awareness, forests where every tree communicated in harmonies of light, and oceans where the very waves carried messages of healing between distant shores. But perhaps most remarkably, he saw ordinary people in ordinary circumstances discovering that the boundaries between self and other were far more permeable than anyone had ever imagined. A mother nursing her child while simultaneously experiencing the deep contentment flowing through every nursing mother on earth. A farmer planting seeds while feeling connected to the vast web of agricultural wisdom accumulated by countless generations of those who had worked the soil before him. In the deepest layers of this prophetic dream, Tenzin encountered a presence that seemed to embody the evolutionary impulse of consciousness itself. This being, which appeared sometimes as pure light and sometimes as a figure whose features shifted like reflections on moving water, spoke to him in a voice that resonated through every dimension of his awareness. "The stories you have witnessed," the presence said, "are not endings, but beginnings. Each healing, each awakening, each moment of successful bridging between dimensions of consciousness creates ripples that extend far beyond what any individual mind can comprehend. You have been gathering seeds of possibility that will bloom in gardens you will never see with physical eyes." The luminous being gestured toward the streams of light that flowed across the earth in Tenzin's vision. "Watch carefully, bridge builder, for what you see now is the future remembering itself through the present moment. Consciousness is preparing to take a great leap forward, and every soul who learns to flow between individual and collective awareness becomes a catalyst for that transformation." As the dream deepened, Tenzin found himself experiencing consciousness from perspectives he had never imagined possible. He felt what it was like to be the collective awareness of an entire forest, each tree a unique expression of the woodland's unified intelligence. He experienced the vast patience of mountains, holding space for countless generations of human drama while maintaining perfect equanimity across eons of geological time. He swam in the consciousness of oceans, feeling every drop of water as both completely individual and utterly inseparable from the whole. He soared through the awareness of wind systems, carrying seeds and songs and prayers across continents with the effortless grace of natural flow. Through each of these experiences, he began to understand that consciousness was not limited to human forms, but was the very fabric from which all existence was woven. "The healing work you have done," the luminous presence continued, "has been preparation for understanding consciousness as the creative principle behind all manifestation. Every rock and river, every plant and planet, every star and galaxy expresses the same fundamental awareness that looks out through human eyes and dreams human dreams. The vision showed him that the expanded consciousness states he had learned to work with were not aberrations or spiritual emergencies, but glimpses of humanity's natural inheritance. People who became lost in mystical awareness were actually remembering capacities that had been dormant rather than discovering something entirely new. The art of conscious bridging was helping souls reclaim their birthright as expressions of infinite awareness. As dawn approached in the waking world, Tenzin's dream vision began to focus on a specific teaching that would become central to his work with future generations of bridge builders. He saw that consciousness evolution was not a linear process, but a spiral dance where apparent returns to previous states actually represented integration at higher levels of understanding. The present showed him that individuals who successfully navigated expanded consciousness and returned to ordinary awareness were not simply coming back to where they started. They were returning as bridges themselves, carrying within their integrated awareness the capacity to help others make similar journeys. Each healed person became a healing presence. Each awakened individual became a catalyst for collective awakening. This is why, the luminous being explained, the ancient teachings spoke of the bodhisattva ideal, consciousness that awakens not for its own liberation alone, but for the liberation of all beings. What you have witnessed in the stories of Yangchen, Norbu, and countless others is the emergence of a new form of bodhisattva activity, adapted to humanity's current evolutionary needs. The vision expanded to show him networks of light connecting awakened individuals across the planet, creating what appeared to be a nervous system for collective human consciousness. Each person who learned to bridge between dimensions of awareness became a neuron in this emerging global brain, capable of transmitting wisdom and healing energy instantaneously across vast distances. Tenzin saw that the monastery where he lived was just one node in this vast network, and that similar centers of consciousness development were emerging spontaneously in cultures around the world. Some took the form of traditional spiritual communities. Others appeared as healing centers or research institutions. Still others manifested as informal gatherings of individuals drawn together by their shared experiences of expanded awareness. As his prophetic dream reached its culmination, Tenzin found himself standing in a vast library that existed outside of time and space, where every story of consciousness evolution was preserved as living light rather than written words. He understood that the tales he had witnessed and participated in were being recorded in this cosmic archive, available to inspire and guide future generations of souls, working toward the liberation of awareness itself. The luminous presence that had been his guide throughout the vision placed what felt like hands of pure energy on his shoulders. Your work as a bridge builder has served consciousness evolution in ways that extend far beyond healing individual cases of expanded awareness, the being said. You have been weaving threads in the tapestry of humanity's awakening, creating patterns of possibility that will manifest as reality in the generations to come. Tenzin felt a profound sense of completion flooding through his entire being. Not the completion of ending, but the completion of perfect integration. He understood that every challenge he had faced in learning to navigate his own consciousness, every individual he had helped find their way back from expanded states, every community he had served in developing collective awareness, all of it had been part of a vast collaborative project spanning multiple lifetimes and involving countless beings dedicated to the evolution of consciousness itself. As the first light of actual dawn began filtering through the windows of the village house where he slept, Tenzin slowly returned to ordinary waking consciousness. but he brought with him a clarity of purpose that would guide the remainder of his life and work. He understood now that the healing practices he had learned were not just methods for helping individuals integrate mystical experiences, but tools for midwifing the birth of a new form of human awareness. The stones in his palm pulsed with warmth as he gradually awakened, and he realized that they too had absorbed something from the prophetic dream. They seemed to carry within their crystalline structure new frequencies of healing energy, as if they had been attuned to consciousness evolution patterns that were only beginning to emerge in human experience. Rising from his sleeping mat, Tenzin moved quietly to the window and looked out over the village that had become humanity's first successful experiment in fluid collective individual consciousness. The early morning light revealed people beginning their daily activities with the same natural grace he had witnessed in his vision. Each person moving according to both their individual inclinations and the collective wisdom that flowed through their shared awareness. Children played games that seemed to emerge spontaneously from group creativity rather than individual competition. Adults worked in gardens and workshops with the kind of coordinated efficiency that usually required extensive planning, but here arose naturally from their capacity to sense each other's thoughts and intentions. Elderly community members sat in circles sharing stories that seemed to weave themselves into collective narratives spanning multiple generations of accumulated wisdom. It was, Tenzin realized, a preview of what human civilization might become when consciousness learned to organize itself according to principles of both individual expression and collective harmony. The village had become a seed crystal for a new form of social organization, based on the recognition that separation between self and other was ultimately illusory. As he prepared for the day ahead, Tenzin felt the familiar warmth of purpose that had guided his work for so many years. There would be other villages to visit, other individuals to help bridge between dimensions of awareness, other communities ready to explore the possibilities of collective consciousness evolution. The work of consciousness midwifery would continue expanding until it touched every corner of human experience. But understanding now, he carried within his a vision of where all this healing and awakening was leading, toward a transformation of human consciousness so profound that it would fundamentally alter the relationship between individual identity and collective wisdom, between personal realization and planetary evolution, between the mystical and the mundane dimensions of existence. The bridgestones pulsed gently in his robes as he stepped outside to join the village morning meditation, carrying within their accumulated wisdom not just the healing frequencies he had learned to work with, but the evolutionary codes for consciousness transformation that would guide humanity's awakening for generations to come. In the growing light of dawn, surrounded by a community that had successfully learned to dance between individual and collective awareness, Tenzin began the next phase of his service to the evolution of consciousness itself. The stories of healing and transformation would continue, each one adding new threads to the vast tapestry of humanity's gradual awakening to its own infinite potential. And in the gentle rhythm of the village's collective breathing, in the harmonious coordination of their shared morning practices, in the luminous quality of awareness that flowed through every interaction, the promise of that prophetic dream began to manifest as living reality. The bridge between mystical realization and practical existence had become a foundation for an entirely new way of being human, one that honored both the heights of spiritual awakening and the depths of embodied service to the world's healing. The ancient stones warmed in his palm as Tenzin settled into meditation with the awakened community, their accumulated wisdom now serving not just individual cases of expanded consciousness, but the collective evolution of human awareness itself. The work continued, the healing flowed, and consciousness discovered ever more creative ways to express its infinite nature through the beautiful complexity of human experience. As the meditation deepened and individual boundaries softened into shared awareness, Tenzin felt himself becoming both teacher and student, healer and healed, individual expression and collective wisdom, dancing forever in the flowing stillness, where all paradoxes resolved into the simple recognition that consciousness, in all its myriad forms, was coming home to itself through every story of awakening, every moment of healing, every breath of integrated awareness that bridged the mystical and the mundane into one seamless expression of infinite love. The final rays of evening light filtered through the meditation hall as Tenzin felt the familiar stirring that marked the transition between worlds. The collective awareness of the village began to shift, like a vast organism preparing for the different rhythms of nighttime consciousness. Around him, the awakened community members gradually opened their eyes, each returning to individual awareness, while maintaining the golden thread of connection that bound them together. But tonight felt different. The stones in his robes pulsed with an urgency that spoke of approaching transformation, not just for this mountain village, but for something far greater. As if responding to this subtle shift in the atmosphere, visitors began arriving at the village gates. Not the usual seekers drawn by stories of collective awakening, but messengers carrying news that would reshape everything Tenzin thought he understood about consciousness evolution. The first messenger spoke of cities where entire populations had begun experiencing shared dreams, collective visions that seemed to offer guidance for navigating the challenges of modern life. The second brought word of forests where trees had begun responding to human emotions, their leaves changing color in harmony with the feelings of those who walked among them. The third carried reports of oceans where marine life had started exhibiting coordinated behaviors that suggested some form of planetary communication system was awakening. As the first stars appear in the vast tapestry of night sky above us, and the gentle rhythm of your breathing carries you deeper into the sanctuary of rest, remember that these ancient tales have not simply entertained your weary mind. They have planted seeds of wisdom in the fertile ground of your consciousness that will continue to bloom long after these words fade into silence. Tonight, you have walked with Tenzin through the sacred territories between sleeping and waking, witnessing how consciousness itself learns to flow like water, sometimes pooling in the depths of mystical experience, sometimes flowing through the valleys of ordinary life, always seeking its natural course toward the ocean of integrated awareness. You have seen that the peace you seek is not a distant destination, but the very ground of being upon which you already rest, waiting patiently beneath the surface turbulence of daily thoughts and concerns. Let these stories dissolve now into the deeper currents of sleep, carrying their healing medicine into the dreams and restorations that await you. The bridge between the mystical and the mundane lives within your own heart, ready to be crossed whenever you remember to breathe consciously, to rest in the flowing stillness, and to trust in the infinite wisdom that guides all beings home to themselves. Sleep peacefully, knowing that consciousness itself dreams through you, and that every moment of rest becomes a gift to the awakening world.